So in this next section, you're going to be reading more of Betty's journals, which really are just such an amazing gift to anyone who's interested in Betty's life.
And I didn't know they existed. It wasn't until after she passed and I moved all her things here to my house, and I found them. And she kept a journal from 1943 to 2018. And when I read through them, what's interesting is like in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, I didn't recognize that Betty.
Mhm.
That was her journey. Like Betty Dodson wasn't born. Betty Dodson, of course, she had a journey.
Mhm.
I don't know why we think she didn't.
Mhm.
And there were moments and times that I sat and I just wept.
Yes. And what you're going to be reading next will be the section when Betty was in her 20s. And then later in her 30s when she was married to Fred. But she struggled. She struggled like all of us did. And her writing is very relatable. It's also emotionally hard to read because I know when I read it, I could relate to it. I was in tears more than once. How about you, Carlin?
Would read them between sessions with clients during
Mhm.
lockdown, doing Zoom work. And I had no idea how disappointed she was
Mhm.
and all the hard struggles she had with trying to find connection,
Mhm.
and especially in her relationships, her romantic relationships. Um, Bob would give her hand jobs, but he wouldn't come out publicly and say that
Mhm.
right, he had a girlfriend, but Betty was the side piece.
Right.
Um, and then her struggles with wanting to potentially be a mother and then not, and then pregnancy. And, I love that piece in the journal that you just found, Laura.
Right. So this will be the very first part that you'll read. She talks about having just washed and dried a Kraft cheese jar to put her urine in to take to the lab for a pregnancy test. That's what it was like in the 1950s. You just couldn't go to the drugstore and get a home test kit. Um, and as she's writing this, I mean, remember, this is her diary. I don't think she ever meant for anybody to read this, which
She
is
never told me about them.
right. So it's so personal, but I think so helpful to read. So as she's writing and getting this ready, she's reflecting on the plight of women and, how difficult it is to be a mother, how difficult it is to love. I like the one line, how many women have clutched their stomachs with knotted fear, pressing to their room and praying for it to be empty. And then she says, how many women have clutched their stomachs praying for it to be full, your womb? So, it's just she's seeing both sides in this very self reflective way. And to be in this moment thinking that she might be pregnant and not knowing, she expresses it so well, what it was like in general, what it's like to be a woman. And yet she's experiencing this right now in her life. So, yes, man can afford to love. To women, it means too much, far too much. Um, yeah. So it's very, very powerful, and that's just like one writing, one entry. Um, it's really pretty amazing. And then here, this one, I love Juan very much, very deeply. And tell us a little bit about Juan
Oh,
because
Juan. Well, Juan, she used to say Juan was my beautiful Spaniard.
yeah.
And Juan, looking like I've read all the journals, was struggling with depression.
Mhm,
And he was her first real relationship after
mhm,
her high school sweetheart, Tommy. And they met in New York. And there's that whole passage where she's going to go study art in Paris. And he's not sure if he's going to go with her. And they go back and forth. And the thing about Juan that's interesting is that Juan came to visit Betty. I met
mhm.
Juan.
Oh,
Betty kept the same phone number and the same address for 50 years.
Mm.
And so Juan came with his two adult children
Wow.
and he had to meet Betty and he had smoked. So he had like a trach in his throat.
Mhm.
And there's Betty, generous, receptive. He comes in, she hugs him. There's
Mhm.
Juan Art. You'll see him in the gallery. He has the dark, dark black hair. And his children said that, oh, my dad used to talk about you so much and so fondly. And in the moment, it was like, oh, Juan. And I thought, Betty, how, generous of you. And
Mhm.
there's Eric walking around. So here's Betty, and she's like got a 30-year-old lover walking around. Juan's there. When I read the journals, and I realized that when she was pregnant, Juan said, you'd be a horrible mother,
Mhm.
and pressed her to get an abortion. I thought, oh, Juan,
Yeah.
that's so hard. That's
Mhm.
just like the knife in the chest. She comes to the realization in the journals that Juan and her, they're not equally suited.
Mhm.
That she is really has all the friends and she is the extrovert and he's this introvert and she makes the break.
Yeah. Mhm.
But they were engaged.
Right, right, right. I mean, it says in her journal, "Juan and I shall marry." I mean, yes. Um, so then after that relationship, again now, it says, today is Monday the 21st, 10 days late. 6 months ago, I asked myself a question: what will I be doing in 6 months? So now here's another relationship, another pregnancy, while she's in Europe, and she's making an important decision about Victor.
And Victor was a jerk too.
Yeah.
Let me tell you. And she was in Amsterdam and they went for an abortion and she had to pretend that she was suicidal because you could only get an abortion in Europe if you were suicidal for the life of the mother.
Mhm.
Um yeah, but Victor came back.
Yeah.
Victor came and with his children to visit Betty. That's
Wow.
what's so amazing. But that's Betty. She was always moving forward.
Right, right.
Right, but we've all been there, and remember, in this time, there was no birth control. To get birth control, you had to be married or engaged,
Mhm.
and she said women would ask their married girlfriends for their rings, and they would go in, you had to lie, and there was
Mhm.
no abortion. It was
Mhm.
illegal, it was kitchen tabletop, so it wasn't now where, yeah, you might have to cross state lines
Right,
now in the United
right,
States, but this was a different game, and she was trying to get through art school, right?
right.
So I think that's what she's lamenting, right? Men can love and have their work and their profession and their education.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Yes. And just like, the angst and the back and forth and trying to reconcile, because there was part of Betty that wanted to be a mother. Um,
Mhm,
but not now. It wasn't in her life's plan. And
mhm.
all of this comes out in her journals as you read. So she's figuring it out. She's working it out, and that's what's amazing because we're all working it out. Especially when we're in our 20s and in our 30s. Some of us are still working it out.
But you know what comes through is Betty's generosity because as she's going through this, she's not focusing on herself.
Mhm.
She's saying all women go through this.
Yes.
Wanting a baby and not wanting a baby, right?
Mhm.
Clutching your stomach and thinking, I want to be pregnant, and clutching your stomach and saying, please, I can't right now. I don't have the money or I don't have the support.
Mhm.
What a generosity of spirit.
Right,
And I
right.
feel like the little glimmer of feminist right
Yes.
there.
Yes, and that's just it. As you're reading these pieces, you wonder, "Who is this Betty?" And then throughout her marriage to Fred too, you'll be reading those journals as well. How much she wanted to make the marriage work and how hard she tried, and how unhappy and dissatisfied that she was. And she kept like circling around and trying.
Ultimately, it was his alcoholism.
Right. Right.
Betty got into AA and said, I don't want to drink anymore with you, Fred, because it was that Mad Men era and he was in advertising. And she's like, I don't want to do this anymore. And then remember the one page where she's so happy because he came to a meeting with her.
Yes, yes,
But
yes.
we know it doesn't stick.
Right,
We know
right.
Fred's gonna be so putting herself first,
Yes.
but, oh, tormented the whole time.
And I think AA, because then there's another section where I put the journal pages together about her journey to self-love, because you can see elements of self-love, like, from the 1950s, like in
Mhm.
her journal on certain pages, her hopes, what she's looking for in this positivity, and then when she starts going to the AA meetings, there's a shift,
Yes.
where she gets sober, and she's thinking, she's working on herself and prioritizing herself, and it's still a struggle, back and forth within her relationships, but I think that that was the biggest shift in her marriage with Fred.
My favorite story from the journals is when they're divorced and Fred
Hmm.
shows up at her apartment, what used to be their marital apartment,
Hmm.
and Fred says, "Oh, I wanna celebrate. He's got a bottle. I got a new job, blah, blah, I got a promotion or something." And she has some friends there and no one's drinking, right? That's like it's passé. That's it. We're in the 70s now. We're in the
Hmm.
body. And Betty says, "Okay, Fred, come in. We'll celebrate with you." And then they go out to dinner. And she said, "I always thought he held his liquor well, but he didn't."
Hmm. Yeah.
And then at one point, she asked him, she said, "Fred, do you think you drink so much if you could maintain an erection and
Hmm.
fully express yourself sexually?"
Hmm.
And he said, "No, I probably wouldn't drink as much if I could do that." And
Hmm.
for me, in that moment, it was like, that's the Benny I know.
Right, right, right. And in future, like, once you get to the 1970s,
Mm,
when she's really discovering herself. That's after her divorce from Fred, and she's really getting into body sex and figuring out her sexuality. Her relationships after her marriage. That's when you start to see Betty growing into who we know her as at the end of her life.
so enjoy them
Yeah.
because they're such a treasure.
Yes. Absolutely, they are a treasure.